because we only have an hour, it's a delight to see our colleague Marina Jirotka. My name is Robin Williams. I'm speaking to you on behalf of the Trusted Autonomous Systems Regulation and Governance Node, and we're delighted that Marina could join us. Now, everybody on the line has already been sent a kind of an outline of the talk and a brief biography, so I will not seek to repeat that. But what I would like to say is that Marina's been a long-standing friend and collaborator with Edinburgh, and Edinburgh in particular. Edinburgh has been involved in a joint, with Edinburgh and Oxford colleagues have been involved in a joint journey which radically cuts across the boundaries between computer sciences and social sciences in addressing how computers are created and how they're used and the consequences they have for society and the risks they may bring. So we've had Stuart Anderson and I have had a long-standing discussion, and this is just the latest stage in a very positive, long-standing collaboration. And within that, people will be aware, or may not be aware from the outline, of the leading role that Marina has played in discussions of responsible research innovation in the area of information and communication technologies. And there was a very high impact set of projects funded by UKRI, the UK Research and Innovation, and by the European Union on a framework for responsible innovation in ICT. So there's a big body of work that we've been discussing with her for decades now, and now of course we're all doing AI and robots, and so we're delighted to hear your thoughts on responsible robotics, what could possibly go wrong. Marina's going to speak for about 35 minutes, and then we're going to have a discussion, and we would encourage people to use the chat. And then depending on how much chat there is and how many people there are, we may get people to come in and give their statements personally. Otherwise, I, and possibly aided by Stuart, will moderate that discussion. So Marina, lovely to hear you, and we'll look forward to your talk. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Robin. You make me feel quite old discussing these things for decades and decades. But thank you so much for inviting me to give a seminar on our research into responsible robotics. I want to give you just a quick brief background on my work at Oxford. For those of you who don't know, I'm Professor of Human-Centered Computing. I lead an interdisciplinary research group in the Department of Computer Science, and we look at different approaches to considering the design and evaluation of technology. So we're really always trying to look at practical ways to develop for developers of technology to do it better, and to take account of the kinds of social work that the societal and social science work that we've been also researching. So we look at methods and approaches for building and evaluating technology responsibly that are really trying to enhance individual autonomy and well-being, and to actively promote and protect human values and the environment. Now, we've recently set up at Oxford the Responsible Technology Institute, and that's really trying to be an international centre of excellence on responsible technology, because it's all very well doing these things in your own country, but these things are now international, they're global. And we want to establish a creative and robust community to try and discuss and develop the culturally nuanced approaches to responsibility and responsible innovation. And the idea is really to take an international focus on these societal challenges that are kind of presented by new and emergent technologies. We want to try and unpack complexities around understandings of responsibility and different regulatory environments, and try and address gaps that exist in industry-related approaches to responsible technology. So the Institute itself draws together strands of ongoing research and investigations of relevance that are for academia, policy and industry, and we directly collaborate with many departments across Oxford and outside. And it's trying to harness the wider networks across the globe and work collaboratively with other organisations to try and be a hub or a touch point on responsible technology for different disciplines. So the projects that we currently have, just as an example, we're now interrogating the climate impacts of ICT that many people know very little about. We're researching into trusted autonomous systems, focusing on vehicles and drones, and designing interventions now to improve adolescent mental health, and particularly their relationship with the digital. I also have an EPSRC established career fellowship in responsible robotics, where we're designing and trialing this thing called an ethical black box to help us to understand accidents and incidents that involve social robots, and I'll go into that a bit more later. And as Robin kindly said, I'm also co-director of the Observatory of the Responsible Research and Innovation in ICT, or ORBIT, and that gives or tries to give responsible innovation services to UK researchers and practitioners. So you can see that underlying all our research in the group is a commitment to responsible innovation, or RI. And today I want to focus on the area of my fellowship, which is that of responsible robotics. And I'm going to start by introducing responsible innovation. Many of you will already be familiar with it. I see no harm in a refresher to just kind of think through those things as we go on. And I'll present it as a response to the ethical and societal concerns in ICT. I'll also look at some of the ethics and standards for robotics, and then I'll go on to present a case study on robot accident investigations, and I'll conclude with some of the wider challenges that we're trying to address in terms of responsible robotics. So just to give a little context on RI, as I say, you're probably familiar with this, but it's useful to kind of frame this for the rest of the talk. The RI initiatives across policy, academia and legislation emerged nearly some 2 decades ago now, and it began with an aim to try and identify and address uncertainties and risks that were associated with new areas of research. And that kind of started with nanotechnology, moving through the environmental and health sciences, including geoengineering and synthetic biology. And the scope of RIs recently expanded to include computer science, robotics, informatics and ICT more generally. As you know, in the EU, where a lot of fundamental research in and for RI has been done, it was a cross-cutting issue in Horizon 2020. And in the UK, the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, or EPSRC, which funds a great amount of research in science and technology, has recently made a commitment to RI across its ICT portfolio of research grants. So what is it responding to? Why did it come about? It's kind of responding to the fact that many of the problems that we face are a legacy of our failing to attend to the potential negative impacts of innovations in the past. And increasingly, the public and media have been expressing these concerns over such negative consequences of our innovations. And this is in a context at the same time where technologies are becoming ever more potent. For example, nanotechnology that's really trying to manipulate matter at a fundamental level, synthetic biology that's trying to create new forms of life, AI that risks de-skilling and defranchising the most vulnerable in society, transhumanism that's trying to transform our human condition by developing and making sophisticated technologies to enhance human intellect and physiology, along with the associated issues of meddling with nature. We have pervasive ICT that's trying to improve human connection, which actually utilizes surveillance technologies, perhaps to our detriment. And of course, social media that has influenced political opinions and spreading hate speech as well, and misinformation. So responsible innovation isn't just a set of nice ideas, but there are some practical actions and a framework that's suggested as a way to carry this forward. And the core aim is really to try to involve all relevant stakeholders, including the public, and to encourage those stakeholders to anticipate and reflect on the consequences of the scientific and technological innovations. And this is also in cases where there's a high degree of uncertainty or ambiguity about those pathways of innovation. So it's been defined as doing science and innovation with society and for society, including the involvement of society very upstream in the process of research and innovation. That is the point sometimes where even that innovation is first conceived. And the point is that you're trying to align the outcomes with the values of society. And it does consist of a set of processes for ensuring that innovation can benefit society. It draws on anticipatory governance, where both the potential positive and negative consequences of an innovation might be anticipated and brought to developers' attention in order to try to influence the development trajectory of that innovation. So although there's a number of frameworks for RI, several are built on the 6 pillars that the EU first identified of ethics, open access, governance, gender equality, science communication and public engagement. And in the UK, as you probably know, building on Owen and Stilgoe's work in geoengineering, the EPSRC harmonized their principles into something called the area framework. So actually, we might have a quick look at that. So what does the area framework actually do? It tries to break down how to consider doing RI into a very broad series of activities. So the first thing is where you're trying to anticipate. And I notice now that there are quite a few conferences on anticipation in this area, which is quite an interesting emergence. So you're describing and analysing the impacts, both good and bad, that might arise from a new technology. And this isn't about trying to predict what's going to happen, but within the bounds of plausibility, you're trying to be as imaginative as possible, opening up the space. Even if there's no concrete evidence, you're trying to envision future consequences. So rather than attempting to try to control the future or passively waiting for the next stage of development to be revealed, anticipation is actively trying to open up the design space. It's creatively trying to look for or underexplored pathways and digging into the possible implications of those. Secondly, it's trying to reflect. It's reflective. It's thinking carefully about the overall purposes and motivations. This is totally opposite to run fast and break things. It's trying to know what is and what is not known, and it's not being afraid to admit that there are associated uncertainties, risks, areas of ignorance, assumption, questions, and dilemmas. Being reflective really in practice is trying to make visible the often hidden dominant values and assumptions of a technology, trying to hold a mirror up to them, and also looking at one's own assumptions as a developer. It's pausing to reflect, recognizing the limits of your own knowledge and being aware of the broader systemic context of the problem that's being tackled. Thirdly, it's trying to engage. It's opening up different visions, purposes, questions, opening up dilemmas to inclusive and wide-ranging deliberation, both through formal and informal forms of dialogue, engagement, and debate. When you do that kind of engagement, this will definitely give you different perspectives and certainly opens up new issues. So that finally, responsible innovation acts to actually try and influence the direction and the trajectory of the innovation process itself. The core idea here is responsiveness as an aspect of responsibility. This might involve formal mechanisms of participation or anticipatory governance, or whatever actually helps to make sure that science and society can be mutually responsive to each other. It's not a once and for all, it's an ongoing process. You're looking at how new technologies meld with old, how people adapt, and how we as researchers and innovators adapt to emerging knowledge of technology use in the world. It's not only individual, but also at the institutional level. Responsible institutions aren't simply reactive, but are willing to embrace changes in their structure, identity, and ways of working. So the framework, as it's set out here, tries to be clear and practical and quite broad, bearing in mind that research and innovation is often unpredictable and unclear. It's not a linear progression from one dimension to the next, but rather an iterative and flexible set of processes. Being responsive includes being reflective and engaging. Often reflection involves elements of anticipation. Engagement can and should throw up new issues which require further deliberation and reflection. So in this way, and the way we see it, is that RI is not at all about closing down options, but rather it's a space for creativity, for confidence, and for serendipity. It's not predefining what are and what are not the right impacts from research, but it is providing us with a framework that can help us to decide what those impacts might be and how we might realise them. However, it's not a silver bullet, and many challenges remain over how to actually embed responsibility into the processes of technological design and development, and I've listed a few on this slide here. In addition, as the pace of innovation continues to grow, this tension between profit and responsibility is also growing stronger, and we're finding that users are increasingly ill at ease in the digital economy, where the values of trust, identity, privacy, and security are potentially undermined by these new technologies. And in relation to this, as I said in my in the abstract, currently in the UK, we found that the researchers and developers who are working in the digital economy are experiencing a lot of uncertainty about where responsibilities lie for tackling harmful outcomes of technological innovation. There are so many controversies now about who should, for example, monitor the actions of algorithms, who is responsible for remedying unfairness or bias in machine learning. So those questions of responsibility are often driven by economic considerations, but we feel the issues run so much deeper and they're implicated in a wider reshaping of institutional, cultural and democratic responses to governing technology. How to divide those responsibilities in the digital economy between developers, civic authorities, users of a technology and automated systems really still represents a series of as yet unresolved challenges. So this has formed the focus for my 5-year established career fellowship called Robotips, or Responsible Robotics for the Digital Economy, which tries to help to address some of the issues of this challenge. The novelty of the work lies in exploring responsibility as a focal topic within the UK's digital economy programme. We'd like to explore and embed a culture of responsible innovation, where responsibility in this context is really much less about individual responsibility and liability, and much more about collective care and responsiveness. We're drawing on recent research in RI to explore responsibility as a practical accomplishment, and we're developing new models and approaches for how responsibilities can effectively be redistributed between people, institutions and computational agents. Now, we're really lucky because Robotips is a collaboration between Oxford and also Bristol Robotics Lab, which if you've never been there, it's absolutely amazing. In these investigations, we're focusing on social robots as a motivating example. Broadly speaking, those are robots which interact with humans on a daily basis. For example, autonomous vehicles, companion robots, toy robots, and so on. In our work, we have defined responsible robotics as the application of responsible innovation in the design, manufacture, operation, repair, and end-of-life recycling of robots that seeks the most benefit to society and the least harm to the environment. As we have noted as well, that RI has engaged less in the past with the environmental footprint of ICT, and we're trying very hard to consider that now as a part of responsible innovation. But why should we focus on RI, you might ask, when we already have quite a few ethical principles and guidelines to help inform design, and also a rich history of reflecting on the ethics of technology. It's interesting to note that an informal survey at the end of 2017 found that a total of 10 different sets of ethical principles for robotics and AI had been proposed by December 2017, 7 of which of those actually appeared in 2017. And now there's many more too. According to recent counts, there's now more than 100 set of guidelines. Now there's a good deal of commonality across these principles, but several stress that the responsibility for things going wrong in a robot must lie with the system designers. And we think that such decisions need a far more nuanced form of governance when thinking about the potential use and abuse of these technologies in context. So thinking a little bit about ethics and standards, then both fit within this wider framework of responsible innovation. RI can provide a scaffold for ethics and standards, as we see in the slide here. Responsible innovation typically requires that research is conducted ethically and the outcomes are ethical, so ethical governance connects RI with ethics. RI also connects directly with ethics through principles of, for example, public engagement, open science and inclusivity. And a further key principle of RI is the ability to systematically and transparently measure and compare system capabilities, typically with standardized tests or benchmarks. But standards themselves are not practice, and neither are ethical guidelines. So to explore this more, we wanted to understand how designers currently orient to this whole body of responsible innovation, and to try to begin to embed practices of responsibility into the innovation of DE technologies. As I said, for the social robotics, the research is going to draws on the expertise of the Bristol Robotics Lab to look at and how to develop accountable and explainable systems relevant to a range of stakeholders, particularly when the technology seems to go wrong, in order to develop more trustworthy systems. So how is it that we come to trust our technology? Well, as a kind of parallel, one of the reasons we may trust airliners until recently perhaps, is that we know that they're part of a highly regulated industry with a very strong safety record. The reason commercial aircraft are so safe is not just good design, it's also the tough safety certification processes, and when things do go wrong, robust social processes of air accident investigation. And we suggest that acceptance of air travel, despite its catastrophes, is in part bound up with aviation governance, which has cultural and symbolic importance as well as practical outcomes. A crucial aspect of the former is that if you render the tragedy of disaster comprehensible through the process of investigation and reconstruction, you may gain more trust in the actual systems themselves. So with respect to this, Professor Alan Winfield from Bristol, who's the co-investigator on Robotips, and I, through various discussions from 2017 onwards, decided to look at social robots through the lens of RI and examine when things go wrong. So let me start with a scenario. Imagine that your elderly mother, Rose, has an assisted living robot to help her live at home independently. The robot is able to fetch her drinks, remind her to take her medicine, and to help to keep her in touch with her family. Then one afternoon, you get a call from a neighbour who's called round and sees Rose collapsed on the floor. When the paramedics arrive, they find that robot wandering around apparently aimlessly. One of its functions is to call for help if your mother stops moving, but it seems that the robots failed to do it this time. Fortunately, Rose recovers. Not surprisingly, you as a member of her family want to know what happened. Did the robot cause the accident? Or maybe it didn't, but it made matters worse. And why did it fail to raise the alarm? Although this is a fictional scenario, it could happen today. And if it did, you would be totally reliant on the goodwill of the robot manufacturer to discover what went wrong. And it's entirely possible that the robot and the company are not equipped with the tools and processes to facilitate an investigation. It may surprise you that right now there are no established processes for robot accident investigation. Of course, accidents do happen, and that's just as true for robots as any other machinery. Finding statistics, though, is pretty tough, but this web page from the US Department of Labor shows serious accidents with robots in the US since the early 1980s. Driverless cars fatalities, of course, make serious headlines, and there have been quite a few since 2016. And we have almost no data on accidents in human-robot interaction. That is for robots designed to interact directly with humans. Here is one, a security robot, that happened to be reported. But we think that a responsible roboticist must be interested in all accidents, whether serious or not. We should also be very interested in near misses. These are taken very seriously in aviation, and there's good evidence that reporting near misses helps to improve safety. So in our work, firstly, we've considered the technology needed to support accident investigation. In a paper published in 2017, Alan Winfield and I argued the case for an ethical black box. Our proposition is very simple, that all robots and some AIs should be equipped with a standard device which continually records a time-stamped log of the internal state of the system, key decisions, and sampled input or sensor data. In effect, this is the robot equivalent of an aircraft flight data recorder. Without such a device, finding out what the robot was doing and why in the moments leading up to an accident is more or less impossible. So currently we have created several model EBBs for different robots and robot operating systems, which robot developers can copy or customize for their own robots. We're also writing an open standard for the EBB. We already have experience within the team of drafting standards for both the British Standards Institute and the IEEE Standards Association, and we're using this experience to draft an open standard for the EBB. And an open standard is simply a standard which is made freely available to all, and our aim is that others will develop EBBs which comply with the standards, thus making it easier for the work of robot accident investigators. But air traffic investigations are above all, social processes of reconstruction, and they need to be perceived as impartial and robust. And they might form a sort of a kind of closure so that aviation doesn't acquire an enduring taint in the public's consciousness. So we're anticipating very similar kinds of roles for investigations into robot accident. Curiously, it's not the black box on its own that forms the safety mechanism. It's its inclusion within the social process of accident incident investigation. An investigation will draw on EBB information and information from human witnesses and experts to determine the reason for an accident and lessons to be learned from it. So alongside the technical parameters of what to record within the EBB, we also have to consider how the interpretation of that data fits into the process of an investigation. So in this project, we're designing and running 3 staged mock accidents, each covering a different application domain. We believe this is the first time this kind of activity is being done, and we're also very lucky to have a real accident investigator helping us on the team. The 3 application areas are assisted living robots, educational toy robots, and bionic prosthetics. In these scenarios, we'll be using real robots, and we'll be looking for human volunteers to act in the 3 roles as the subject of the accident, witnesses to the accident, and members of the accident investigation. We were all, I have to say, set to do the very first one of these just before the pandemic, and then the Bristol Robotics Lab closed, well, everything closed, and so we've been slightly delayed in these, but we're anticipating we can start again in January, fingers crossed. So what we're trying to do is develop and demonstrate both technologies and processes and ultimately policy recommendations for robot accident investigation. And the whole project is being conducted within the framework of responsible innovation. It will in effect be a case study in responsible robotics. So why do we need robot accident investigations? Although robot accidents are thankfully quite rare, the scope for accidents in second wave social robots is much greater than first wave industrial robots, and here are 3 reasons. First, industrial robots operate behind safety cages, where social robots are designed to be among us, up close and personal. It's this close proximity that gives us the greatest risk. Second, industrial robots typically operate in an environment that's optimized for them and not really for humans. Social robots don't. The unpredictability of human environments is much more likely to cause social robots to fail. And thirdly, the range of serious harms that can arise from social robots we feel is greater than those associated with industrial robots, since it includes both ethical and psychological harms. So let's go back to our fictional scenario. How do we expect the accident investigation to play out? First, the accident investigation team collect testimony from witnesses, including Rose herself. Key points from the witness testimony are: the neighbour finds Rose on the floor in the kitchen and immediately calls for a paramedic. The paramedic attends to Rose, but also reports seeing the robot in the living room. He also notices that Rose is not wearing her fall bracelet. The cleaner reports that she cleaned as usual, including disinfecting the robot as instructed. Rose, after recovering, reports that she wanted something from a kitchen cupboard, climbed onto a chair to reach it, and fell. She also remembers calling out for help. Next, the accident investigation team will look at the data from the robot's ethical black box and construct the simplified timeline shown here. The interactions with Rose are shown in orange. The robot movements are shown in blue. Note that in reality, these would show the XY positions of the robot. Robot connection status to the home hub is shown in green. The robot's connection with the home hub is important, as this is how the robot connects with both the home's smart sensor network, including Rose's fall bracelet, and how it also raises the alarm in case of an accident. Then, bringing the witness testimony together within the EBB data, the accident investigation team construct this why because graph shown here. Why because analysis is well-known. It's a well-known technique for establishing causal links between events, unevents, things that should have happened but didn't, states and processes. The root causes are at the bottom of the graph and resulting accidents at the top. In the analysis of Rose's fall, we can see that there were actually 2 accidents. Accident 1 is Rose's fall, and accident 2 is the robot's failure to raise the alarm. So the why because graph for Rose's accident is actually 2 linked subgraphs, as shown here. The key findings of the accident investigation are that accident 1, Rose's fall, was caused by her unwisely climbing onto a chair, and 2, the robot's failure to raise the alarm was caused by a combination of sensor and connection failures. And the investigation team's recommendations are: 1, equip the robot with a backup communication system in case the Wi-Fi fails via a 3G GSM connection, for example. Equip the home with the ability to send an emergency call directly via a landline, for instance, when the fall bracelet is triggered, so that this particular alarm isn't actually routed via the robot. 3, improve the sensitivity of the robot's microphones to increase their range. And 4, add a new function to the robot so that it reminds Rose to put on her fall bracelet every day. And finally, advise the cleaner not to use disinfectants on the robot. I think for more detail of this case study, I've given you some references at the end. The paper Robot Accident Investigation is amongst those. From the social process of accident investigations, I don't think that we can actually underplay the importance of looking at this form of EBB explanation in the social context in which it will inevitably be used, not least so that we can have a model of what that social context will need to be. We need to think about how an investigation should be structured in order to give trusted outcomes. What are the important roles and evidence that need to be presented? What sorts of social dynamics and power relations exist? How are these mediated through the processes of the investigation and through the technology that it both investigates and uses to help with its investigations? We're also going to think about how to gather appropriate data for the EBB and how to design its capabilities. Most importantly, how it can explain its behaviour and how these explanations can be made relevant for a range of participants, in particular those in post hoc investigations of accidents occurring with the robot. Eventually, we'd like to allow the robot users in care homes or in accident investigations to be able to ask a robot, why did you just do that? And to get a very simple answer, or even in the future to ask, what would you do if? The team is working with business designers also and partners to co-develop these requirements for the EBB in each of those case studies that I mentioned. And at the same time, we're trying to understand how those designers themselves are orienting to the notions of responsibility in their practice. So gathering the data for the EBB is a very important part of this project. And that also implies a clear area of concern for recording, which is that of privacy in the EBB for humans, where social robots are interacting with them. The increase in the use of social robots leads in almost all cases to an increase in recording, with the exception being of very simple robots. And robots are attractive because of what they're capable of doing, navigating a room, having a conversation, calming a child. Yet their differentiation from more classical electronics is exactly what makes them most attractive, the fact that they can collect and act on information. And this can be done through a variety of ways: video, audio, or sensory data. And while sensory data is the most privacy friendly, as it's least likely to reveal personal data, it provides the least information to the robot as well. Video and audio recordings are really intended to take in information about the surroundings in order to interact with it, but therefore also increases surveillance in the spaces that they're inhabiting, even if surveillance isn't the primary purpose. Sensitivity information is collected as matter-of-factly as anything else, and all the more likely to be so as social robots extend to individual homes. And with this expansion to homes comes the erosion or invasion of the private space. Most people have ideas about where they are likely or unlikely to be overheard and the appropriateness of topics within that space. There's an understanding, albeit imperfect, of who one might rely on for discretion or dissemination. There's an advancement of this understanding to include digital recordings, but really that requires an understanding and an awareness of where and how the recording might take place. While a person might balk at their host setting up a video camera on a tripod during dinner, they're far less likely to object to or even notice an automated vacuum cleaner. This sort of contextual, area-based privacy began to be eroded a while ago with things like virtual assistants. Not only are they vulnerable to security attacks, but they're also listening beyond what many of their users would assume. Whatever their wake word is, they are listening. Robots take this several steps further. Not only do robots have the potential to be in a variety of spaces, but also to move between them, entering and exiting situations and conversations unannounced. This erosion of privacy can be as basic as a back garden or as intimate as a bedroom or bathroom, and applies to any inhabitants or visitors in that space. The third privacy concern is, of course, access by third parties. The potential concerns around recordings aren't generally based on the fact that the robot is listening or watching, but the idea that another person is or could be. And this depends on several factors: the retention periods and use of recordings, the measures taken to protect them, and which parties have access, either intentionally or unintentionally. Recordings might be used for immediate function of the robot or to improve its use over time, potentially by investigating issues, such as using the EBB. But even well-protected recordings can have audiences that are unsuspected by the user. Google admitted in 2019 that contractors could access recordings made by the Google Home Assistant. Even more seriously, Amazon's Alexa was effectively called to give evidence in a double murder case in the US as early as 2018, with a valid warrant served based on the probable cause that the Echo had picked up audio recordings during the attack. Beyond such drastic uses, the basic privacy concerns of excessive sharing and processing can lead to both chilling and conforming effects as information is shared from inside to outside the home, as people become more aware of the home as a less private location. There's been a growth of guidelines and standard setting in robotics to the response to these ethical and societal concerns. There's the British Standards Institute BS 8611 for the ethical design application of robots, the IEEE's recommended practice for assessing the impact of autonomous intelligent systems on human well-being, or the European Data Protection Board's adoption of guidelines on virtual voice assistants in July 2021, which includes guidance on compliance with other legislation such as GDPR. While current laws and regulations such as the UK GDPR will and do apply to recording and personal privacy, these do not satisfactorily address the broad spectrum of concerns. While they may establish best practice standards for, say, data processing by companies, breaches do still happen, and there is a significant gap between the standards and enforcement. While video and voice recording purposes should be documented and have a lawful specified reason for recording and likely explicit consent, it is unlikely that individual users will connect the idea of surveillance with what is marketed to them as something as very different, a toy, a care aid, or a mop. Additionally, some of the best practices and requirements around recording, such as informing those that are being recorded, do not address concerns such as psychological repercussions in chilling and conforming effects. Being notified of one's recording in a corner shop on a train station is very different than being notified of being recorded in a friend's back garden, whether or not that recording is likely to be used. It is important that we incorporate, normalise and build on the standards and guidelines that are built from responsible innovation in order to maximise not only the utility of social robots, but prioritise the preservation of human rights and dignity. So one of the areas that the Robotips research is looking into is a practical and practicable framework for developers to engage with in creating these responsible robotics. Considerations of how technical and socio-legal concerns can best be incorporated into human-centered practice. Privacy is just one of those elements and leads us to some serious but contextual questions of how much information is necessary for the purpose of each individual robot, how data collection can be minimized, accessed and protected, and privacy invasion rebuffed, among other concerns such as transparency, accessibility and accessible explanations. Privacy is not alone, however, and the societal implications have to be considered alongside the technical. The language that we use to discuss and examine innovation is important, a concern that's reflected in IEEE's ontological standard for ethically driven robots and autonomous systems. Other incorporated RI elements include primary and secondary harms, both positive and negative. What happens if the robot doesn't work properly? What happens if it does? Key to the concept of doing science and innovation with society and for society is engaging with not only the technology itself, its function, accuracy, bias and utility, but also its broader effects, such as its environmental impact, psychological effects, and even dependencies. This is not to say that such deliberations are straightforward, but that they are necessary in shaping not only the world that we wish to see, but the world that we'd like to live in. So we're doing some more kind of a wider sort of research issues that I won't go into right now, but we can talk about in the discussion. But what I wanted to end on really is that it's actually when things go wrong that we are able to kind of see much more clearly what is happening. It's a fundamental contention of our work that if we increase transparency of how these technologies make decisions and take users' obligations and their lived experiences seriously in the design of these tools, and we are seen to be doing so, that we can increase potential trust in these technologies. It is really, in the end, when things go wrong, that the responsibilities throughout the chain of creating, commissioning and deploying social robots can take centre stage, albeit retrospectively. And the proposed case studies are actually a vehicle for understanding what those chains of responsibility will look like when a harmful incident takes place, and give us an unparalleled opportunity to simulate disaster in a safe way to try to understand how to manage its consequences. So I just want to say briefly, this is the members of the Robotips team, and we're all doing this work together, and they've been absolutely brilliant. It's a fantastic team. And this our advisory board, both project partners, academic collaborators as well, and also the Responsible Technology Institute team and the projects that we're actually involved in. And that's, thank you very much from me. I hope I've done it in time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marina. That's really interesting, and it has already stimulated a whole range of questions. Stuart, do you want to come in first? Then maybe Peter Davis, and then Michael.
Sharing? Yeah, should I stop sharing? Yeah.
Yes, you're still sharing at the moment.
Am I?
I'll just. Sorry, wait a minute. I'll just ask one. Shall I, Robin?
Seen, because she's been speaking to us online, so hasn't seen those questions.
Yeah, there we are. Okay, so I'll just ask one. I'll ask this first one that I like. So, do you think that risk is an essential aspect of responsible innovation? Yeah, or do you think the issues around estimating likelihood of rare events and estimating the consequences of those events pose issues for RI in the technologies we're developing now? You know, I'm particularly thinking, you know, when you look at rare event estimation and you look at consequential things for rare events or for catastrophic events, there are huge errors typically. And so I wondered whether you felt that leaning on risk too hard might actually make responsible innovation more difficult.
Obviously, when we're looking in a constrained area like robotics in this context, it's a hugely important part of what it is we're doing. Rare events can come and take us by surprise like a pandemic, as anything else. So I think in terms of the processes of that thing, I'm not sure about the estimation of them, because anticipatory governance would say, actually, even if there's no evidence for something, you will still take this seriously. You will still prepare for this. So, I mean, that is probably how I would phrase that. I wouldn't phrase it in terms of it offers challenges for responsible innovation in the sense that it may not work in that sense, because the whole idea is that you are preparing for this in an uncertain and potentially it may not happen future. But you're better prepared should it happen. I think that's what they argue. You're creating a capacity for being able to address it, or kind of if that sort of challenge happens.
Yes. Okay, so it comes to some of the other questions that I was going to follow up with, but anyway, maybe, I mean, there's a slew of questions that maybe you can look at later, Marina.
I'll look at them later and I'll try and answer.
Yeah, I think probably Peter should go next.
So Peter Davis was next, and then Michael Robertsos, and Nick Colosimo has his hand up then, so put him forth.
Hi Marina.
Hello.
Thanks very much. Very interesting talk, and I guess my bit also came in on the responsible innovation stuff. A lot of the interest that I have around automotive and autonomous systems operating in there have basically highlighted the fact that these are complex systems with emergent properties, and I guess it's the same when you're doing research. The ability to actually work out what it is you think you're going to get out of this and be right is kind of not one of the things we're actually good at. Generally speaking, most of the benefits come in areas that we hadn't foreseen, in sectors that we hadn't foreseen, and I guess I'm just asking how your techniques really cope with this completely unforeseen nature of things.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that we're doing at the moment is looking. We have such a wealth of experience of technologies and things going wrong that we're trying to build on those understandings and experiences now. So, for example, Robin and I were at a seminar on quantum computing, and there were lots of discussions about artificial intelligence and the things that have gone, the issues and challenges, the societal challenges around AI, and how we might then start to look at those in relation to quantum technology and what might be happening there in the future. This isn't about predicting. I think, as I said before, it's not about saying this will, we predict that from the laser we will all be in supermarkets having, cash points. It's not about that kind of effect, as far as I can see, but it is about anticipating from what we know at the moment to what could happen in the future. It's not prediction, it's anticipation, and there may, we might miss it altogether, but at least we're trying.
Thank you.
That might be a very unsatisfactory answer. I'd love to be able to say we could predict it completely.
Michael, you're next. This will come up again.
Hi, Marina. Thanks for a fantastic talk. So my question was related to something that actually Stuart asked, which was around the scalability of RRI, not just in terms of it creating more work for more projects and more innovations and how we can do that, but also around kind of my question was, is there a way we can do this somewhat hierarchically? Can we have a discourse about kind of general big choices that we need to make, for example, in an application of robots in a particular domain, and then kind of reuse some of those decisions we've made as our research and innovation paths become more refined, and then so we can somehow kind of build on the work that's gone before in terms of the ethical assessment. Carolyn has very helpfully commented that you've done some work on that, but I just want to hear your take on that.
Yeah, we have done some work on that, and I think generally more work could be done. I think Robin and I at one point tried to look across responsible innovation in nanotechnology, so lessons learned. What can we take forward from these activities? And that piece of work definitely needs to be done even more. Yes, we can learn, but I think we have to keep checking, because the contexts change around us, the geopolitical landscapes change, so we always have to keep an eye on that as well. But we can certainly learn from previous exercises.
Yeah, I mean, specifically for adoption in industry, I would hope that if I'm going to build a certain new robot in a similar scenario, I could at least build on what's been done before in terms of the RRI.
Yes, definitely, and of course that I think there is a PAS, there is a responsible innovation standard now, which is trying to help in that aspect as well. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Nick Colosino and then Ian Pyle after Nick.
Oh, hi everyone, and thank you for an excellent talk, Marina. So Nick Colosimo, BA Systems and Cranfield University. So I love the idea of Robotips, and it was something that before, I think you mentioned Alan's involvement as well, that it was just the kind of thing right up his street as well. So I mean, we've done some work in the past on back to 2015 on visualization methods for interactions and decisions made by UAVs, so that you can readily access and gain situational understanding very, very quickly in real time, as well as for the forensic purposes that you've mentioned. One of the challenges with these approaches, and I think it's the same with the inner speech or inner monologue approaches. So Pipitone, the paper that came out last year, which was really about explainability as a contributor to human-machine trust, is you can only go so far. You can only go as far as some of the models, the underlying AI models, will allow. Many of which are black box in nature, high levels of or approaching non-determinism, if you will. And so, a good example would be if in the robot that you showed, there was an image classifier to detect rows, but now that model believes that rows is a table and that's where dinner goes, then that could be catastrophic. It's dinner on the lap, isn't it, in that case? And and we know how difficult it is to try and understand what's really going on in something like a convolutional neural network. How do we get over that? How do we develop and build trust in those situations? Does it come back to what you were alluding to before, Marina, which was in a way safe crowdsourcing? You know, lots of iterative tests to build up that knowledge bank and experience in a safe way, whereby you want as much transparency as possible, and you really do want things to go wrong because it's a safe environment first of all for them to go wrong.
Nick, that's exactly what we are doing, and we have actually anticipated that particular accident where Rose fell, and actually the table fell on top of her, and when the robot looked at that whole thing, the robot didn't recognize Rose as a person with the because the table fell on top. So there are various scenarios that we would, we'd love to have the time to carry on testing all of that, but I think that would be how you would build those things up before letting it completely run loose on an actual. I like the idea of crowdsourcing those scenarios. It's great. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ian Pyle.
Is my voice coming through all right?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Thank you, Marina. A very interesting talk. You've convinced me of the value of the passive ethical black box in comparison with an active conscience, but thank you. But I'd like to refer in the context of responsible technology to a generation or so ago and the introduction of atomic energy, which came with the atomic energy bomb and the fear that that produced, which made a big problem for the development of atomic energy for civil purposes. And then the unexpected happened, that the problem of disposing of the ash, so-called, from the radiation products became the dominant problem to be solved, which hadn't been anticipated at the time. So let's leave that. And now I very much applaud your focus on anticipation, which is something that robots can't do. People don't do very well either. And one of Asimov's laws required the robot to be able to anticipate, and that's one of the things that was wrong with them. So I applaud your work of trying to focus on anticipation, and by thinking of what might go wrong, helpfully avoid the likelihood of that actually going wrong. Thank you. I've enjoyed listening to you.
Oh, thank you. I think it's it's a very difficult thing to get across to people, though, because typically innovators and computer scientists don't want to think about things going wrong. They don't want to think about that. Everything's going to go right, and the whole narrative isn't one that sits comfortably with research and innovation. So that's one of those challenges. But once they start and they realise that it's not about tripping you up or saying no, that it's actually about opening up the design space, then I think we have a much better chance.
I've been keeping patient in my role as chair, but there's a question I really want to ask, which is this question: the focus on anticipation in RRI, and how we balance upstream engagement and reflection with downstream post market monitoring, because that's where the intent. I mean, I think we need to anticipate as much as we can. But I'm wondering if we also need to complement that with a much more stringent and much larger scale post-launch evaluation and learning first. But linked to that, if we think about the character of AI as a kind of configuration that's a dynamic configuration, where the algorithms and the data sets are likely to be changing all the time. So our conventional approaches to safety assurance, which are based on kind of a waterfall model, where you say this is the object and we'll test it and we'll certify it, those conventional models are really potentially challenged by the dynamic character of AI configurations such as robots.
Yeah.
So what is the balance between evolution and static products, and between upstream and downstream engagement?
But I think from your example, Robin, that's always been the case, because when people have developed technology, they know that users will use these things in unanticipated ways, and they do. But there's never been any kind of monitoring of that on various levels. So what we need is also to follow it through, as you pointed out, that the upstream is extraordinarily different to what happens downstream. Yeah, what actually happens or can be, because it is much harder, particularly if it's very theoretical, to anticipate some of those things very, very upstream. Then the ways in which that they translate into a technology that becomes embedded in society or normalized is also can be very different to that first exercise. So it needs that kind of agile monitoring as it progresses, as it emerges, as these things can emerge in development or they can emerge in use. And it's, as you know, innovation isn't a linear progression anyway. And it's an issue of many hands. You know, the people who develop something or the idea may not be actually what the person who's developing or the company that's developing it actually turns out as. So, you know, there's a huge set of issues in that, which are very complex. But I can only see that we keep that kind of somehow, and I don't know how, that monitoring continuing as these things become normalized.
Yes, Stuart, did you want to come in on that? And Shannon. Stuart first and Shannon. You're muted, Stuart.
Let Shannon go.
Shannon.
Sorry, were you calling my name? I'm having some difficulty with my computer here.
Hi, we can hear you. Yep, we were calling you.
Yeah, Robin, I'm sorry. What did you ask? Were you just wanting me to expand upon my comment in the chat?
Yes, please. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just following up on just reaffirming what Marina already said about the need to avoid a kind of sort of constrained environment where there is something like toxic positivity going on, where identifying failure points and weaknesses and kind of chains of breakdowns in systems is de-incentivized. And I've seen that happen in project teams where the person who says, I'm worried about this, is the one that causes their manager to grind their teeth in front of everybody. And those send very clear signals, in contrast to, you know, older cultures of safety engineering where there's incentives, ideally, for identifying potential failure modes that have previously gone unnoticed. And so I think we need to not try to reinvent the wheel necessarily, but look at other traditions of technology development that have already encountered these problems and developed norms around them. Stuart was talking about, you know, the adversarial context that we're in increasingly, and I was pointing out that this is something that people like DJ Patil, who was leading the kind of data science effort for the Obama administration years ago, was talking about needing to borrow from cybersecurity practices like red teaming to start responding to the adversarial environment. So these are all things that we could do, but haven't, as Stuart says, haven't really been permeating the research and innovation context, particularly in computing.
I think so. Just to some of the things that we've been doing as we're training the next generation of computer scientists is to try to do precisely that. They're not used to doing that at all. So, you know, to try to get them to think about what might go wrong is quite shocking, or to actually start to even think about critiquing something is quite shocking. It's seen as an attack, a personal attack, and an attack on their work. And that has to be sort of brought slowly, softened into something that shows them actually this creates much more innovation for you. And the younger ones get it because they are living in that, you know, with the consequences, whereas perhaps some of the older computer science professors have less time for things like this.
Marina, that's been really useful. And we have a whole load of comments that you might want to look at when you get a chance. But many people will have booked just for the hour and have had to leave. If you could stay for a couple of minutes, we could just have a little bit more kind of chat to follow up some of these points. But I shouldn't miss the opportunity to thank you. And to say I hope that this is not the end of the engagement between the TAS node and Marina Jirotka, but the beginning of that close and productive engagement. But it's been great, very interesting, and I think we've identified a strong convergence of interest and concerns here. So can we thank you in the conventional method, which is now apparently by putting electronic clapping hands up on the screen, but that's hard to do. We'll be doing a bit of that too. Okay, so there will be a recording of this made available through the nodes if people want to come back on it. But that's been very helpful indeed. Thank you, Marina.
Thanks.
So Marina, you're involved with the people at Bristol.
Yes, Alan Winfield. Sorry, my brain's going. Alan Winfield, and he's part of the Bristol Robotics Lab, and Anouk as well, whose second name escapes me at this moment. Is Anouk here?